Folks. I'm
Hey
Dr.
everyone.
Gordon Walker. This is Hamilton Pevec. Hamilton and I connected last year while we were at the Telluride Mushroom Festival over a shared love of cheese. And Hamilton
hmm
had gone to France and made this awesome documentary about cheese making, but needed a little bit more sort of scientific, gravitas and color and context for the documentary. So we did sort of a web interview, and he edited that in and made this awesome film that you guys just watched. So Hamilton, can you tell us a little bit about like that trip to France and what inspired you to make this film?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm a cheese lover, if it wasn't obvious.
Same.
I was in France, leading forays, like part of like a sort of boutique foray expedition type of mushroom retreat type thing in the Southern Alps. And I was collaborating with my friend Robin, who runs an adventure company there, and where his house is in a small village, just the next village over, like a 10-minute walk from his house, is this village Saint Luce, where there is this organic farm and where they produce the cheese. And the moment he told me about it, I was like, I want to go there and learn about the cheese. And then I met Vincent Rosé, the main older gentleman in the film, and he was just so charming and nice. And I asked him if I could, if he would sit down and talk to me about the cheese process, and he agreed to do it. And yeah, the film was born out of that, just being in proximity to a organic cheese farm, and then having this very lovely, charming French gentleman to tell us, to sort of walk us through sort of the philosophical, poetic side of cheese making. And then, of course, on the spot, I wasn't planning on it, but Clement, it was the young man in the film who just happened to be making cheese that day when I went back to shoot. And then, so I shot all of that principal photography first, and then I met you and was like, "Hey, I need some context. I need some scientific to lend sort of some context to what we're seeing and why it matters." Because we're looking at like a microbiological metabolic process, and it's really difficult to show that. And so I thought, well, if I can't show it, then we can talk about it. We can explain what's happening. And then after I interviewed you, I actually returned to France last year and shot the pickup shots of all the close-ups of the cheese mold. And so the film took 2 years to shoot. I mean, there were two primary sessions of shooting, but over the course of 2 years. And I'm just so pleased that it worked out. I'm so pleased that I got to meet you and that we got to connect on our shared passion for cheese. And yeah, now the film is out for the world thanks to you and your channel. So I'm thrilled to see, that everyone gets to watch it now. Um, and can I pick your brain a little bit now?
Sure. Can I ask you, do you have
Yeah.
the YouTube playing in the background? Because I'm getting like a reverb.
I have it playing, but it's on silent.
I think it's connecting via your Bluetooth.
Oh, crazy. Okay, let me turn it off.
Because I'm just hearing your
Okay,
words.
how about now? Is that better?
Mm, it's now I'm hearing my own voice.
Shit. What is that? Maybe it's the double mic. How about that? Is that working? No, no. Doesn't sound good now? Oh, okay. It looks like my hold on a second. Oh, weird. Should be working. My headphones should be working.
Let's see, you're frozen. This is the fun part of doing live stuff, is you can have conversations with people, but there's always slight technical things that jump in. Yeah,
I
go
can
just go
I
ahead and
can
ask
hear
me.
you.
Okay, I can hear you fine. It's just that I can like hear our conversation delayed by like 15 seconds in the mic, but it's all
Oh,
good.
that's terrible. Yeah, so what I wanna know, and this is something I never got to ask you before,
Hmm.
is, have you ever consulted on a cheese project as a fermentation expert? Like, have you ever been involved in a cheese making?
No, my background is mostly wine fermentation, liquid based stuff. So I haven't done
Mhm,
much cheese, but I have visited many different cheese making places and seen some of the process. There's one up in Mendocino called uh, Penny Royale that makes a lot of goat cheese. So I've
mm,
seen their process kind of like very up close and gotten a good sense
yeah.
of like the different types of cheese they make. But I'm not qualified enough knowledge wise to actually advise people on cheese making. I'm just kind of a fanboy.
Yes, yes. I'm definitely qualified to taste it.
Yes, eating it definitely. Yes, yes to that.
Um, so okay, so here's the other thing that, like, I didn't even realize when I was filming the close-ups of the cheese, and then I only saw it in post-production when I was actually editing these macro shots of the cheese, are all these little insects crawling over the surface.
Mm. The
And,
mites,
the
cheese mites.
mites. Yeah,
Mhm,
cheese
mhm.
mites. So what can you share with us about cheese mites and their role in this process?
God, I'm not sure. I just had to
You're
Google
Googling it?
cheese mites, yeah. Um, I mean, the interesting thing that I think you brought up in that film was he was talking about, I forget what he called it, but like cat's hairs, like the mold that kind of like grew
Yeah,
all over the surface of the cheese. And any person who's familiar with food says if there's mold growing on this, it's probably bad.
right.
But for those cheeses that are being made in that specific place, in that, climate, habitat, that cheese cave, there's an ecological succession that happens on a cheese. So one mold does its thing, another mold does its thing, another mold does its thing. And each one of those adds something special to the cheese, whether it's, enzymes that are breaking down certain compounds or creating, film around the cheese. But it is that multiple succession of organisms that generates that cheese. And like you
Yeah,
said, adds that complexity, that depth of flavor, that thing that makes it really special and from that particular place. Like the
yeah,
cheeses, you gave me some, so I got to try them. They were not plain orange cheddar. They were these incredible, symphonies of flavor and texture. And it was because
yeah,
of all those microbial inputs. And it's a microbiome thing, right? There's lactic acid bacteria in the cheese, there's fungi often on the surface of the cheese because fungi usually need oxygen to be
mm,
growing. So that's why they're on the outside. The lactics are on the inside. And together they're making that cheese safe. And honestly, if there's cheese mites, they're just part of that process because they are
right.
also part of that little microbiome ecosystem that's happening on the surface of the cheese. And I know that, for stuff like mimolette, which is a really famous French cheese, it has to have the cheese mites or it's not mimolette. So I think
Really?
I think that's
Oh,
pretty cool.
oh, fascinating. So it's interesting that there's a parallel between sort of the fungal progression. And if you look at something like, let's take like burn morels as a parallel example, where they're the first ones to pop up after a burn, and
Yes.
then, or maybe along with a handful of other species, and then there's a progression of different fungi species all doing their part to remediate the damage that the fire did to that area. That's okay, it's beautiful for me to think about that a similar parallel process is happening on a sort of microcosmic
Right.
scale with
Micro
the
scale
milk.
versus macro scale, but it's the
Yeah,
same sort of thing. If there's available nutrients, fungi are going to show up and
yeah,
start eating. And the
yeah,
fact that fungi are often the first ones on the scene allows everyone else to kind of like sort themselves out because like fungi are basically setting up the architecture for who else can play in their sandbox when it comes to bacteria and
yeah,
other microbes.
yeah.
So in a similar way, from a piece of cheese to a whole burnt forest, it's a good parallel.
So one observation was, like you mentioned, the cat hair mold. The mites weren't on the surface of the cheese with the cat hair mold. They came later.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
know, so maybe those first couple of, molds, kind of set the stage for the mites to create or the right environment for the mites to be, nurtured or attracted to it, I guess my next question is where do they even come from? Like, are they born of the cheese? Are they, like, how do they even get there?
Well, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. Part of it is, that cave has probably been used to make cheese many years in a row. So they are part of the microbiome of
Of the
that cave.
environment. Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
right.
what you see, and I saw a really interesting talk on cheese microbiomes back when I was in grad school from a researcher who'd been at Harvard, and there was a lot of sort of ego with the French and then Italians when it comes to cheese, right? They're very
Mhm.
proud of what they make, and rightly
Totally.
so. It's usually very good.
Yeah.
But everyone wants to believe that what they do is really special. And to some degree, it is. The cows in that particular place, their cheese making thing, the way they do stuff, each one gives it distinctiveness that makes that cheese what that
Yeah,
cheese
yeah,
is.
the
But
terroir.
the terroir, exactly. But fundamentally, if you look at cheese, if you treat it in a similar way, no matter where you are in the world, it's going to end up with a similar mixture of microbes. So whether it's like a dry Parmesan versus like a wet wash drying cheese,
Right.
you end up with very different microbial things based on how you treat it. And
Mhm.
so if you set up a cheese cave and you let it run wild, you're probably eventually going to end up with cheese mites. If you wash everything down every other day with bleach, maybe you won't get cheese mites. But if you're
But
that French cave, which looked very rustic, probably has cheese mites.
right, right. And I mean, in terms of the traditional process, it's those microorganisms that are present are what give the character and the flavor to the cheese. So, in a way, if you washed everything with bleach, you absolutely have to be introducing strains and species of fungi to inoculate the cheese, right? Like you can't really do both and expect something natural to happen. Like, you can't really, or I mean, maybe you can, like bleaching everything and then hoping something happens afterwards. I don't know. Maybe you just get the most crazy bleach resistant forms of
Well,
I
I
don't
mean
know. I
that's
don't know if you want to be eating that.
that's sort of the fundamental difference that I talked about very briefly in the film. There is, European cheese making is you're doing something. I'm not going to say unique, but something very methodical and
Mm,
maybe let's just say natural in a particular place for a long time. So you've developed a certain succession of organisms that are present in your environment, and that's part of these cheeses that are from Europe. They're at a particular elevation with certain humidity. The microbes that are in the air are part of what have made that cheese special, but they've been making that cheese in the same place for, I don't know, 300 or 400 years more kind of thing. So it's a really well established process. And at that point, they don't touch it. They just let it do what it does. This is a similar
mhm.
thing with a lot of European wines. They've been making wine in the same place for such a long time. They just bring the grapes in, make the wine, and whatever happens, happens. In America, where we have very clean facilities, we wash everything down with bleach. Our approach is to add microbes so we know what they are. And in that sense, we have a lot of consistency and we have a lot of safety and we can ensure a high quality product. American cheese is great. It's just not quite as interesting because it doesn't have quite as much character. And that's very much what you showed in that film, I think,
Yeah.
and did a good sort of deep dive into what makes the cheeses from that particular place so special.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Totally. I mean, it makes me wonder, like, it makes me wanna learn more about cheddar in particular, and which microbes are involved in cheddar making and sort of
It's
at
mostly
what
lactic acid bacteria. There's not a lot of fungi in cheddar, as far
oh,
as I
at
know.
all, in none of even, like, the sharp cheddars.
I'm not going to say none, but I'm.
Yeah,
It's mostly things that have like a bloomy rind. So Camembert, Brie, Brilliant Savarin, those all have
right.
penicillium on them. Blue cheeses have penicillium. The wash rind cheeses are the ones that have the most like weird microbiome and the kind of the funkiest stuff going on the
Mhm.
surface. And there's if you look, I before we talked for that film, I did a little mini deep dive into like cheese microbes and was sort of overwhelmed by the amount of life that was in there and how many things I wasn't necessarily familiar with. Penicillium, I know, is it's kind of the
Yeah,
classic thing you think of blue
yeah.
cheese and bloomy rind cheese, But
Yeah.
there was a whole bunch of other stuff that I didn't know much about. And so, in our chat, I was trying to surmise a lot of stuff fairly quickly. But you
Yeah.
can get really deep into it. And I wouldn't be surprised if there was some kind of fungi involved in cheddar, but I know as far as I know, it's mostly lactic acid bacteria and salt. And what cheddar means is it's a cheddaring process. They take the big block and they chop it up into lot of little pieces, and then they smush it together. And that's
Oh.
cheddaring. Cheddaring refers to the process
Oh.
rather than like the microbes.
Really? I had no idea.
Yeah.
So is that's a particular technique to a place?
Uh, well, so
Or
cheddar is like a method.
so the method is named for chopping it up, not
Bingo.
where they chop it up.
Yes, it's
Okay.
it's the chopping it is what, as far as I understand, that's what cheddaring is.
Oh,
So
fascinating. I didn't know that. Yeah, I mean, it's one of my favorite flavors of
same.
cheese, and, I have to give credit to those bacterias for doing the heavy lifting there, that's great.
Well, I think I mentioned it when we talked the first time, but I don't think it made it into the film. But do you know why we have orange? What cheddar is orange in the United States?
Oh, yeah, you did.
Yeah.
I forgot.
So cheddar. If you make cheddar, it's white. Milk is
Yeah,
not orange, right? So to get orange cheddar, they have to add annatto. They add a food coloring, natural food coloring. And that's
right.
because when cheddar, back in, I don't know, turn of the 18th, 19th century, something like that, back in the day, a couple hundred years ago, cheddar became very popular. But the cheddar that got popular was this very special cheddar from Jersey cows that were eating milk in the spring, and they were eating a lot of flowers. So there's a lot of the pigments,
Oh,
carotenoids
yeah.
that went into the milk, and it gave it this sort of beautiful orange hue, and that was associated with quality. So cheddar from England that was made with these cows in the spring was this sort of light orange color, and so that was associated with quality. And instead of making cheese like that in America, they just added orange food coloring. But
Of
that's
course.
why orange cheddar is so pervasive. It's this consumer preference from like 150 years ago is why we have orange cheddar now. But you know, if you look at
Amazing.
cheddar elsewhere in the world, it's not orange. It's just in America.
No. No, no, no. I mean, I'm a big fan of the coastal cheddar, um, which is one that I get from Costco. Really rich, crumbly, white,
Mhm. Mhm.
super flavorful, melts perfectly. Okay, so talking about penicillium, there's an article that's been floating around. It kind of came onto my radar across my feed, let's say, like 4 or 5 months ago, and it has to do with the threat of Penicillium camemberti strain of fungi, basically running out. Is like it's like cheesemakers, from what I understand, cheesemakers have been um, cultivating it in order to inoculate milk in the cheese making process, but for some reason, it's not reproducing on its own anymore. Like those strains that they have um, selected for are now getting tired, and this is like kind of terrifying for cheese lovers to consider that it's possible that we could actually lose these types of cheese because we actually have departed from these traditional ways of cheese making enough that the species are endangered. Are you familiar with this? Can you comment on this?
I
Like,
vaguely remember seeing like maybe a Reddit headline about it, but there's
yeah,
two things going on there that I want to touch on.
yeah,
So the first one is penicillium uh, is very capable of making mycotoxins, and so mycotoxins are extremely carcinogenic even at very low levels. And so cheese making in America is very tightly controlled and tested to make sure that mycotoxins are not getting into the cheese. And that we're eating safe cheese, because even a small amount of mycotoxin can cause, long-term health effects, carcinogenic. Uh, and we've selected for particular penicillium strains that have a much lower likelihood of producing penicillium.
mhm,
Something like Aspergillus oryzae koji has a wild counterpart that makes a lot of mycotoxins, but koji itself has actually lost the genes to make those mycotoxins. The
oh,
penicilliums
interesting.
we use I don't believe they lost those genes. It's just unlikely that they'll make mycotoxins. But it's part of why we need to continue to test cheese to make sure it's safe before we feed it to people. And it does occasionally happen where like a cheese will end up having mycotoxins, ended up getting rejected from the US, because I believe that's one of the criteria to sell European cheese in the United States is they have to be tested for mycotoxins. So in America, we've been using these strains that are safer, right? And we test them. But part of that means you have the strain and you just continue to propagate it. You make more and more of it. But that's asexual reproduction.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
mold is at no point, rolling the dice and redoing sexual reproduction because they don't want it to. They want it to be the same thing. So it's consistent. It's good. America, consistent, right?
Right.
But part of that is over time, that genome, do you know about telomeres? Like every time it replicates, the genome might
Yeah.
get a little bit shorter. And
Right.
chromosomes have things on the end of them called telomeres, which are sort of like the little plastic piece on the end of your shoelace that keeps it from fraying. If shoelaces get old and the plastic falls off, your shoelaces start turning to strings and your genome starts degrading. So that may be part of what's happening with these penicillium strains that have been replicated, again and again, propagated for so long, is their chromosomes are starting to fray and they're not as consistent.
That's
And
tragic.
well, I mean, you should always have like a stock you can go back to. And I'm not sure
Right.
why they don't have a stock they can go back to frozen from like, I don't know, 30 years ago with the original selection, because you could just
Right.
propagate that and redo it all over again. This is what they do with brewing yeast.
Yeah.
Or alternatively, what they could do is if they really are losing these penicilliums, they could go to Europe, go to some of these places like where your guy was, and sample some of the native wild diversity of penicillium that are still ideally relatively safe, relatively
Right.
consistent, and then bring that back to US and either try to get those to breed with the strain that they have, and then do selection to make sure they have one they like, or to just start propagating this new one. So to me, it doesn't really seem like it should be that big a problem if they do some basic
Yeah.
fungal biology and breeding,
Yeah.
but there may be some stuff at play there that I'm not familiar with in terms of the degradation of the genome
I
or production
agree.
of mycotoxins.
I agree. I mean, the way you described it goes, oh, I feel so much better about this situation because there's somebody out there who cares enough to go and do the wild harvesting necessary to bring these strains back to life. One of the articles that I read on this topic talked about a particular cheese farm that still has some original strains, um, some kind of blue cheese that they're gonna like leverage in order to save these other industries because they're sort of married to this particular aesthetic of the like clean white rind on these bries and camemberts, and how like that dominated because of the quality of the rind.
Hmm. Hmm.
And but anyway, apparently, it's not such an emergency after all. Maybe that's, the way you describe it, I feel like, okay, maybe there's hope for us.
I think that what it could be is maybe that white one was like a mutant that didn't make any pigment, so it's white, and
Yeah,
thus it got propagated just like a white button mushroom. Same thing as a cremini. It's a mutant that didn't make the melanin. So there's
sure.
probably a mutant that was white, and maybe that's the one that's like starting to degrade. And so really what they need to do is like again roll the dice a little bit and then select for a mutant or
Yeah.
an offspring that would have the same white mutation or also be lacking the thing that caused it to make pigment. So I have a feeling that we'll figure it out, but it might take some time.
This kind of is reminiscent of what happened with a beer and sour beer, using these wild yeasts to create these sour flavors, where for generations that was something that was considered unpleasant or ruined or whatever. And so they,
Mm.
I mean, of course, there's taste everywhere. I'm speaking generally. Um, but then, somebody sometime found one, and they, the cultural or social tastes shifted enough to sort of allow for these wild strains to be used in a commercial setting and now every microbrewery, in America has their own sour beer, um, which is sort of, it's good. I'm into them. But I wonder, is there a is it a similar risk factor when you propagate particular yeasts for the beers that we are forever familiar with, like, the way that, you have your lagers and your IPAs and your ambers and all of that. Like, how much of a departure on a microorganism level is a sour beer from an IPA or whatever?
Well,
Or do I just not understand this at all?
no, 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 no. You're onto something. I'm just trying to think about. There's a couple parts to answer your
Yeah,
query. Um, so yeast in general, you'll have like a stock that's frozen, so you can always go back to that yeast.
yeah.
Brewers will usually use their yeast about 10 to 12 times where they're propagating it in between each set of brewing. And often what they'll do is they'll brew like a lighter, lower alcohol beer first, and then flip it into higher and higher alcohol. So usually an IPA will be brewed. IPA has a lot more stress. So once you've brewed an IPA with your yeast, you often trash them because they're tired. Whereas if you're fermenting something that's lower alcohol, like an ale, you can do more batches before they get
Yeah,
kind of tired and start producing off flavors.
yeah.
Or then you have to go back to your original like freezer stock and cultivate, grow up a whole new batch. Uh, for sour beers, the traditional way to do it was they were made in something called a cool ship, which was basically a giant open container. So they'd pump all the hot ale, hot wort into this big container that was open to like the ceiling, and they would just let it sit there and cool down. And all the little yeast and other things from the ceiling would kind of float down into the beer. And that's part of how they got that kind of mixed microbial thing. Again, secession and same kind of microbiome idea as your cheese cave.
Oh, interesting.
And then over time, that sour beer would age. And most sour beers are actually a combination of like a 3 month aged, a 6 month aged, and like a 9 month aged, and occasionally like a 12 month aged bit, and they combine that together into a bottle to make like their sour beer blend.
Oh,
And you're
really?
putting in more of the younger beer and sort of dosing a little bit of the older beer to give a little bit more of that sour, funky character. And those are traditional barrel program sour beers. And Gren Rodenbach and Duchess de Bourgogne, some of those really incredible special sour beers that I absolutely love. And actually, in a lot of those cases, you brew a base beer called a lambic, and then you'll do, or like a brown ale, and then you'll do a secondary ferment with fruit, and that's how you make lambics and other versions
Right,
of those
right.
sort of Belgian fruit beers. In America, again, for consistency, we have invented a new style of beer called a kettle sour, where you brew a beer and then you add some lactic acid bacteria once it cools down a little bit. And so instead of adding yeast, you're actually adding bacteria first. And you let those go for about 24 to 48 hours. They produce a bunch of lactic acid. Then you bring it back up to heat and kill off the lactic acid bacteria, cool it back down again, and then you add your yeast and you ferment that out. So you get a sour
Oh,
beer in like a week instead of, 9 to 12 months kind of thing.
yeah.
But just like we talked about, it's sort of a one note sour. So if you've
Right.
had some sour beers that are like really crisp and refreshing in like a
Yeah,
can, like 10
yeah,
barrel is one that comes to mind.
yeah,
Uh, it's not a sour beer in the same way where it's not a mixed microbial ferment. It was just like sometimes they'll even just dose in straight lactic acid, but at least I think it tastes a
yeah.
little bit more natural when you do that bacterial ferment. So
Oh, fascinating.
again, we're seeing the big differences between like traditional European practices that rely on these microbial secessions and kind of innate microbial ecology of a special space versus America, where we clean everything, we sanitize everything, and we sort of add in exactly what we
Yeah,
want, so we get the consistency at scale,
yeah. Right, right, right. Because we want
just like
if
cheese.
if there's anything that Americans love, it is, um, knowing what they're gonna get. Like the
Yes,
fact that you can order, McDonald's French fries
right.
any chain
Anywhere. Yep.
anywhere in the world,
Yep.
and it will taste
Tastes the
exactly the
same.
same.
Yep. Same.
And
Same with Applebee's. Same with all of our
yeah,
chain stores. That's why they're popular, because people. It's not that they're very good. It's just
yeah,
that you know what you're going to get.
that's right. That's right. Yeah, jeez Louise. Well, I'm always into some unknown. I don't think we'd be mushroom hunters if we weren't willing to risk not finding mushrooms.
Sometimes you got to take a risk.
That's right. That's right. Well, I'll say, just the other day, last week, I went to go check my high elevation morel spot, and it delivered wonderfully.
Saw your
And
post. Looked good.
and it was just like so exciting, of course, and pretty special in Colorado because we just don't get the same kind of morel seasons as you guys get out on the West Coast, or in the Midwest. You know, we have this very narrow window of opportunity, and they don't flush like they do in these wetter places. However, um, we prepared them with a buttermilk blue cheese. After I cooked the water out, after I we sautéed them, we added chunks of buttermilk blue cheese, and it was one of the best morel meals I've ever had. It was off the charts, and, of course, fungi with fungi is always complimentary for the most part.
It's hard to go wrong with morels and cheese, that's for
Y
sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so it's been 30 minutes. Do you wanna still keep going? You got anything on your mind you wanna share?
I think I might sign off. I got some. I actually am still working on the book, and I have a tremendous amount of stuff to do. But I'm really stoked for Telluride this year. Seeing
Yes!
you again. I'm going to
Right.
be doing a social media panel, so that'll be exciting. I'm
I'm
definitely
very excited about that.
looking forward to the puffball and getting to
Yes.
dance and party, and maybe we'll come up with another film while we're there.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Hey, I'm always open to it. I shoot films faster than I can edit them. I'm so excited that you're gonna be presenting at Telluride. I'm really looking forward to the social media panel. And of course the puff ball. I will tell your audience that my next film, don't tell anybody. There's only 5 people left on the stream, but my next brand new film is gonna screen at Telluride, and I can't tell you more than that.
Very
You
cool.
you
Very
9
cool.
people, you shh.
Your brother might have spilled the beans to me a little bit last weekend, but
Oh,
I'm
oh.
excited.
It's okay. You're allowed to know.
You guys should come to Telluride Mushroom Festival. You can meet Hamilton and I, and come see his new movie. So,
Yeah, great. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you so
uh,
much, Gordon. Really appreciate it.
absolutely, it's good to see you, man. Be
Yeah,
well.
you too. Take care.
Bye bye.